Thank you for joining me today. My presentation is entitled Biological Control Agents Used on Extension Property for Brazilian Peppertree, Old World Climbing Fern, and Melaleuca. My name is Ken Gioeli. I'm the University of Florida IFAS Natural Resources Extension Agent for St. Lucie County. So we hear a lot of people talking about invasive plants in Florida. So exactly what are they? Well, there are approximately 4,800 plant species in Florida, and about 1,500 of them are exotic. In other words, they come from someplace out of the state. There's an organization that is called the Florida Invasive Species Council. It used to be called Florida EPSI, but they've changed their name. And they basically break out plants that are considered invasive into two categories. There's a category 1, which has about 80 species in there. And they're invasive exotics that are altering native plant communities by displacing native species, changing community structures or ecological functions, or hybridizing with natives. And then there are also considered to be category 2, and there are about 85 species in there. And that is defined as invasive exotics that have increased in abundance or frequency, but have not yet altered Florida plant communities to the extent shown by category 1 species. The University of Florida does not use this particular list generated by Florida Invasive Species Council. We actually use something called the Florida Assessment. Before we get to the Florida Assessment, what is the story behind the invasive plants that we have? Well, about 60% of the invasive species were brought here deliberately. In other words, somebody thought that they would make a good landscape plant or were brought in for cultivation or some other purpose. For maybe erosion control, ornamental, medicinal, or food practices. Some of them were accidental introductions, 12%, and that includes aquatic weeds such as alligator weed, and then Caesar weed, which is that weed that if you go walking through the woods, you'll get stickers on your clothes, and sometimes it's from Caesar weed. And this is seeds or other papules that contaminate the environment. We carry them in by accident, and sometimes, like in the case of Caesar weed, we carry them in on our clothing. And then about 28% of them are unknown. We just don't know how exactly they got here. So why are some plants invasive and some are not? There's something called the enemy release hypothesis. And let's say you have a non-native plant to Florida and it's found somewhere else in the world, usually in that tropical band around the equator, or about the same latitude that we're at, either north or south of the equator. And that plant is in its native range, and there are a number of different herbivores and other disease-causing agents that keep it in control. So you see this graphic here, we have this flower and then this cricket, and the idea here that is being shown is that there are insects and other things down in the territory for these plants, the native territory, that keep them in control. But when you take them out of that place where they co-evolved with all of these other organisms, and you bring them to Florida where these other competing organisms are not found, it's like they're bursting free. It's like, I'm free to do what I want any old time. And they take off. And it actually takes quite a bit of time for the environment to adjust. And sometimes, like in the case of Brazilian pepper and Melaleuca, people have to get after it to keep it in control. Otherwise, it would take over. Now, the University of Florida does not use that Florida Invasive Species Council list. We don't generally refer to that. We do something else. We have this IFAS assessment, and it's assessment.ifas.ufl.edu. It is a wonderful resource managed by Dr. Dia Laurence. And basically, if you have a plant that you suspect might be invasive, you can put the common name or you can put the genus and species name in the search engine box, and you just click search. And what happens is it'll look it up and it'll give you information about whether or not it's safe, you should use it with caution, warning, or if it could be considered likely invasive. And what it does is it will also give you any of the legal reasons why you might not be able to plant them. In other words, if it's prohibited by law somewhere in Florida. So this IFAS assessment is a research-based assessment tool that we rely on as extension agents. And I would definitely recommend people look for information about the suspected invasive plants in this database. So the topic of my presentation is about the use of biological control And here at the Extension Office in Fort Pierce in St. Lucie County, we've actually introduced some natural enemies, some biocontrol agents. These are agents that are USDA certified. They've gone through considerable research. Usually there's international exploration that's done. The scientists go back to the home territory where the invasive species evolved, and then they look for other organisms that are competing that might be keeping it in control. And then they see if they can be brought back to Florida safely without itself becoming a problem. And there's quite a bit of an assessment that happens. So we don't just take any old insect from abroad and bring it into Florida. It has to be proven that it's not going to be a problem when it's brought in, and that's going to be host specific to the invasive species that is under consideration. On extension property, we have Brazilian peppertree. We have a biological control agent called the Brazilian peppertree thrips. We also have Melaleuca, which is that last slide. We have Oxaps vidiosa and some other insects that I'll talk about that are in there helping us manage invasive Melaleuca. And then we have Old World climbing fern, Lygodium microphyllum, which we've just recently introduced a couple of biocontrol agents to help us keep ahead of the invasive species on property. So this is the aerial map of the Extension Office, and you can see that we do have quite a bit of natural surroundings around us. Unfortunately, the perimeter of many of these areas, that fringe trail, for example, where there's an actual natural gas pipeline that goes up the middle, bisects one corner to the other, and that has patches of many of the invasive species: earleaf acacia, Brazilian peppertree, Old World climbing fern, and then we also have Melaleuca. And luckily, we put some biocontrol agents out there to help us keep ahead of the issues. So the first biocontrol agent we'll talk about is the Brazilian peppertree thrip. And this is the first biological control agent that was approved for release in the state of Florida for Brazilian peppertree management. And as you can see in this slide, it's just a little tiny black insect, and it does a really great job of chewing up the leaves of the Brazilian peppertree. It just weakens the plant. And it is being released in various areas across the state of Florida, particularly in Central and South Florida. And on the Extension Office property, we actually have a couple of demonstration research sites. So one of our grad students, Emily LaFalchiere, has been studying the insect and its movements, and that's one of the projects that she has going on at the Extension property. So in fiscal year 2015 through 2016, South Florida Water Management District spent $2.6 million to control Brazilian peppertree on their properties in Central and South Florida. The Brazilian peppertree thrips were recommended for release by USDA back in 2016, and the insect, of course, is native from Brazil, which is the same place, of course, that Brazilian peppertree came from. The nice thing about using this insect is it reduces the plant height, reduces the number of green stems it produces, and causes flowers to basically die on the tree. The plants are slower to recover, and they're less vigorous after they've been attacked by these thrips. So the next biocontrol agent that we'll talk about is for Melaleuca quinquenervia. That is one of our worst of the worst invasive species in Florida, and it actually worked on a project called Tame Melaleuca back in the late 90s, and it was very successful, and this was the first biocontrol agent that we released, and this is Melaleuca weevils and Oxaps vidiosa. This was our first success story working with biocontrol, and we do have these insects doing a great job for us on extension property. Basically what they do is they scarify the leaves. The eggs will hatch on the leaves. They'll turn into this gooey looking caterpillar-like larva, and the larva will just start chewing on the leaves. Eventually the larva will fall to the ground and they pupate. In other words, they turn into almost like a chrysalis of a caterpillar. They'll pupate in the soil, and then when they hatch out, they crawl up as adults, and the life cycle just continues. And you can see what the adult looks like. It's that little gray weevil that we see in that other photo. One of our newer biocontrol agents for Melaleuca is the Melaleuca gall midge, Lophlotoplosis trifida. And almost every branch, especially newer branches of Melaleuca now, have been attacked by this Melaleuca gall midge. And if you look at this very closely, you can see that it's almost like a warty deformation in the branches themselves. And what happens is the midge, as an adult, will lay an egg on the branch, and then the branch of the Melaleuca will produce a gall, almost like a wart over the egg, and then the egg will hatch out inside of that gall, and then it'll tunnel out, and the immature will tunnel out, and then eventually the adult will just kind of fly away and start the whole life cycle all over again. So that is the Melaleuca gall midge. And the last Melaleuca biocontrol agent we'll talk about is the Melaleuca psyllid. Now, this is not in any way, shape, or form the citrusillid, which is causing damage. This is for Melaleuca only. Boreoglycapsis melaleucae, or Melaleucae, depending on who you talk to. And it's a little psyllid. It's kind of a yellowish color. They'll fly around. Their entire life cycle is arboreal. They'll be in the canopy of the Melaleuca tree. And what they do when they're in their immature stages, called an instar stage, they produce these little filaments, and you can see this white cotton candy on the branches. They produce these filaments, and basically they're sucking the sap out of the branch, out of the leaves of these trees, and they do a really great job, especially on new growth. So this is our third biocontrol agent that we have for Melaleuca. And between Oxalis videosa, the gall-producing midge, and the Melaleuca psyllid, they're doing a great job, especially controlling Melaleuca seedlings that might be sprouting up. And the last invasive plant that we have that we'll talk about on extension property is Lygodium microphyllum, also called Old World Climbing Fern. And there is a moth called the Lygodium moth, and you see I'm holding that little test tube, that little container that has a moth in it. These are tiny. They're about the size of my fingernail, and they'll fly around and they will lay eggs on the Lygodium, the Old World Climbing Fern. And you see the underside of one leaf in this picture that has immature larval form of the insect that's just chewing away and really doing a good job of attacking this vine. Once again, it's host specific to Lygodium, and it's not going to be a problem on other plants. They're just really doing a good job of helping us keep up with the invasion of Old World Climbing Fern. And the very last biocontrol agent that we'll talk about today is the Lygodium mite. And we aren't actually seeing the insect in this particular photo. I took this picture in the field at our extension office in Fort Pierce, and you'll notice that the tips of each of these leaves has this curling, and that's actually the plant's reaction when the mites are on it. So this is how we know that the Lygodium mites are doing their job. The plant causes this deformation where it's rolling up like that. So they're doing a really great job helping us out. Thank you for joining me today. We have briefly gone over some of the biocontrol agents that we can find on extension property, and I'd like to thank my colleagues, the City of Port St. Lucie, for being there to help create that video on Brazilian Peppertree biocontrol. I'd like to thank my colleague, Dr. Carrie Montier, who is my go-to expert when it comes to biological control of invasive plants, and she is at the Indian River Research and Education Center. And then, of course, Emily Lafalchiere, who is our student working on Brazilian Peppertree thrips biocontrol, doing some of the research in the field on extension property. So I'd like to thank them and thank you for joining me today.